happens when the empire built on fear begins to fear itself. Moscow's streets no longer echo the calm of authority, they tremble under the weight of chaos. Flames from burning cars flicker against Soviet-era apartment blocks. Masked men in military fatigues roam through the suburbs of Lyubertsy, shouting orders not from the police, but from a new force born out of desperation. The Russian community, once an online nationalist group, now patrols the capital like an army without a flag. And while the Kremlin boasts of control, the truth is laid bare. The war Putin launched abroad has come home. By late October 2025, Moscow resembled a city under siege. According to Reuters and BBC reports, over 80 migrants clashed violently in the Prokshino district. Knives, hammers, even axes were wielded in the heart of Russia's supposed stability. The police stood aside. Videos swiftly censored online showed bloodied streets and terrified bystanders. What once was called Putin's fortress had turned into an urban battleground. This wasn't an isolated riot, it was the symptom of a deeper disease. Russia's vertical of power, built over 2 decades, is collapsing under its own contradictions. The Kremlin's reliance on millions of Central Asian migrants to sustain its wartime economy has become its Achilles heel. Without them, construction sites fall silent, ammunition factories stall, but their presence has ignited the fury of ultranationalist militias. Two monsters, economic necessity and ideological extremism, now tear at each other while the state looks away. Defense news analysts describe a security vacuum unprecedented in modern Russian history. Police forces, underpaid and demoralized, refuse to confront mobs. Instead, masked paramilitaries step in claiming to defend the Russian order. In reality, they defend nothing but chaos. Jane's Defense Weekly highlights the growing resemblance between these militias and warlord factions in failed states organized, armed, and increasingly answerable to shadowy Kremlin patrons rather than the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The war in Ukraine has drained Russia's resources. Now its capital mirrors the very anarchy it once claimed to extinguish abroad. Similar scenes have been witnessed in other empires stretched too thin. Israel, struggling to contain urban unrest while fighting Iran-backed militias, faces the same paradox: security eroding from within. The United States under President Trump watches this disintegration closely. Washington's intelligence circles see Moscow's internal fracture as both a warning and an opportunity. The illusion of Russian unity has shattered. And yet, for ordinary Muscovites, these geopolitical calculations mean little. Parents hurry their children home before dusk. Markets close early. Fear seeps through daily life like winter fog. The state's most sacred promised safety is gone. So the question lingers over Moscow like smoke over a battlefield when the guardians of order turn into predators who will protect the people. The rise of Russkaya Obstina, or the Russian community, was not a coincidence, it was a design. A shadow born from the Kremlin's own paranoia. Dressed in camouflage, armed with bats and iron rods, they patrol the streets not as citizens, but as soldiers of ideology. Their stated mission to defend Russia from migrant crime. Their real purpose to fill the vacuum left by a crumbling state. According to an in-depth investigation by Medusa and confirmed by BBC monitoring, the group now operates cells in over 30 Russian cities. Telegram channels coordinate raids, share footage of street operations, and glorify violence in the name of order. Membership is estimated in the tens of thousands. These are not isolated extremists. They are the architecture of a new paramilitary empire, financed and protected by figures inside the Kremlin. At its center stands Alexander Bestrykin, the powerful head of the investigative committee. Sources from The Guardian and DW report that his office has quietly funded and trained these units through unofficial security budgets. Ostensibly, they assist law enforcement. In reality, they compete with it. A network of outlaws sanctioned by the state, each operation blurring the line between legality and rebellion. In this internal web of loyalties, the Russian police have become spectators. Officers in Moscow complain anonymously to Reuters. We're told not to intervene when the Russian community acts. They say it's for the good of public order. What happens when justice itself becomes outsourced to radicals, when the state no longer trusts its own law enforcement? The answer lies in Moscow's dark alleys and Telegram chat rooms. These groups do not obey Putin, they obey the survival instincts of the deep state. Defense experts at Jane's compare them to Iran's Basij or China's urban militia networks, irregular forces created to preserve internal control at any cost. But control is slipping. The Russkaya Obstina, once a tool, now acts with impunity. Their expansion reflects the Kremlin's greatest fear, losing monopoly over violence. Political scientists call it institutional cannibalism, when the state's organs devour each other to preserve influence. The FSB versus the Ministry of Defense Bastrikan versus the Interior Ministry, each faction breeding its own loyal fighters. What began as a strategy of divide and rule has evolved into a civil war for Moscow's streets. And yet this struggle is not confined to Russia. Across the world, the echoes are unmistakable. In the Middle East, Iran empowers militias to suppress dissent while keeping deniability intact. In Asia, China strengthens paramilitary police units to enforce ideological purity under the banner of stability. These systems built on fear and fragmented power reveal the same pattern when institutions' wrought shadows rise. Under President Trump, Washington views this militarization of internal repression as a strategic warning. The United States has long balanced freedom with security, but in Russia, the pendulum has swung entirely toward fear. America's intelligence briefings leaked through Al Jazeera describe Moscow's situation as unsustainable authoritarian entropy, a system consuming itself. The question now gripping analysts from Berlin to Washington is chilling. When a government arms gangs to maintain control, how long before those gangs turn their weapons on the government itself? The FSB was once the unchallenged guardian of Putin's empire, an omnipotent machine of surveillance and intimidation, but in 2025, it has become a serpent devouring its own tail. The agency consumed by infighting and purges now directs its power inward. While migrant gangs and paramilitary militias dominate Moscow's suburbs, the FSB's focus lies elsewhere, eliminating generals, silencing rivals, and protecting the fragments of its influence within the collapsing system. Reuters reports that in September, several senior officers from the Ministry of Defense were detained on charges of dereliction of duty, but insiders told The Guardian the real reason was simpler. They had criticized the FSB's growing grip over wartime logistics and civilian control. Those arrests sent a chilling message: the real battlefield isn't in Ukraine anymore, it's within the Kremlin walls. The FSB's divide and rule game has unleashed monsters it can no longer tame. According to DW agents, quietly supported ultra-nationalist groups like Russkaya Obstina to undermine the Ministry of Internal Affairs, portraying the regular police as ineffective. But that manipulation backfired spectacularly. The streets of Moscow are now ruled by gangs that owe their loyalty not to the Kremlin, but to their own commanders and financiers. In leaked intelligence assessments from Jane's Defense Weekly, Russia's capital is described as a patchwork of armed fiefdoms, each aligned with competing Solovik factions. The investigative committee funds one group, the FSB sponsors another, and the National Guard struggles to maintain coherence. Moscow, once the beating heart of Putin's control, now resembles Baghdad in its darkest years, a city divided between power brokers' checkpoints and ghosts of loyalty. The strategic cost is devastating. Putin's entire doctrine, the vertical of power, depended on total coordination between his security organs. That chain is now broken. In trying to suppress dissent and corruption, the FSB has inadvertently fragmented Russia's internal stability more effectively than any foreign adversary could have dreamed. American intelligence sources cited by Defense News note that the FSB's purges have crippled Russia's decision-making speed. In a world where crises evolve by the hour, the Kremlin's paralysis is a gift to Washington. Under President Trump, the U.S. exploits this chaos with precision tightening sanctions, expanding covert operations, and reclaiming strategic prestige across Eastern Europe. NATO planners in Brussels reportedly see Russia's implosion not as an accident, but as the natural consequence of a regime stretched beyond its limits. The parallels are haunting. Iran facing internal factionalism between the IRGC and clerical elite mirrors the same decay. In China, Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaigns have become purges reminiscent of Stalin's fueling quiet resentment within the PLA. History repeats: when empires fixate on control, they inevitably fracture from within. For Russians, the human toll is immediate. Ordinary officers see their superiors arrested overnight. Police avoid patrolling after dusk. Citizens whisper that Moscow's chaos is approved from above. Every institution has become a suspect. And as the FSB hunts for traitors among generals and ministers, the real traitor hides in plain sight, the fear that once kept Putin's empire intact. The question now haunting the Kremlin is no longer how to win in Ukraine, but how to survive in Moscow. Russia's economic engine, the one that once powered its war effort, is now sputtering in the smog of its own contradictions. The very workforce that keeps its ammunition factories and construction sites alive has turned into the regime's greatest liability. Millions of migrant laborers from Central Asia, once welcomed as the invisible fuel of the war machine, are now treated as disposable enemies. In the suburbs of Moscow, industrial ghettos stretch for miles. Al Jazeera and Reuters document the squalid dormitories where migrants from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan live cramped unpaid and often beaten by corrupt police. Yet without them, the Russian economy collapses. They build the bunkers, the roads, the factories that sustain the war against Ukraine. They are, as DW calls them, the conscripted civilians of a failing empire. But the balance is breaking. When wage theft and xenophobia mix with hopelessness, riots erupt. What began as labor exploitation has become open warfare in the streets. Knives and axes in the hands of the desperate have replaced words and protests. Putin's grand promised security in exchange for obedience has been shattered. The chaos he once exported has come home. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly warn that this social implosion is strategically catastrophic. A regime dependent on cheap foreign labor cannot maintain legitimacy once those workers become both victims and scapegoats. The ultranationalists, emboldened by Kremlin-linked sponsors, now justify their own violence as patriotism. It is as one BBC correspondent described a war within the war, one fought not with tanks but with resentment. While Moscow burns, the ripple spreads outward. In Kiev, Ukrainian forces exploit Russia's distraction, launching precision drone strikes deep into occupied territory. In Tehran, officials see Moscow's unrest as a cautionary tale: what happens when ideology overtakes governance. In Beijing, Xi Jinping studies Putin's dilemma closely. China's reliance on internal surveillance and migrant labor from rural provinces mirrors Russia's model: an empire sustained by obedience, not prosperity. The lesson is chilling: the tighter the grip, the faster the fractures. President Trump, observing from Washington, reportedly views Russia's turmoil as strategic proof that authoritarian economics fail. American energy exports surge as European markets distance themselves from Moscow. NATO's unity, once fragile, is reinvigorated by the spectacle of Russia's internal decay. For the first time in decades, Western intelligence agencies find themselves studying not Russia's missiles, but its collapsing neighborhoods. The human toll, however, transcends strategy. Families in Moscow now live in fear of night raids, sometimes by police, sometimes by militias pretending to be them. Migrant workers vanish after protests. Young Russians, jobless and disillusioned, are lured into paramilitary gangs promising order. It is a mirror of what The Guardian calls post-imperial entropy, a state turning its citizens into hostages of survival. And through it all, the paradox remains: Putin cannot abandon the migrants who sustain his economy, nor can he control the radicals who hunt them. Both monsters are his creation. Both now fight for dominance in a capital that has forgotten peace. So the question remains echoing through every broken streetlight and empty market: how long can a war machine survive when its own gears are grinding each other to dust? Saint Petersburg, Russia's cultural soul, has become the echo chamber of defiance. On October 25th, a crowd gathered near Nevsky Prospect. No slogans, no banners, just music. A small street band, Stop Time, began playing Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Within minutes, hundreds joined, singing softly beneath the city's gray skyline. It wasn't a concert, it was a funeral for the regime. That melody, once played endlessly on Soviet TV during the fall of leaders, has returned as a symbol of collapse. BBC News Europe captured the moment before riot police intervened, dragging away the musicians as the crowd whispered, "It's happening again." The images spread like wildfire across social media before being erased by censors. But censorship cannot erase memory. Every note of Swan Lake has become an unspoken question: how long before the tanks roll again? The youth of Russia, those who grew up under Putin's shadow, no longer fear him. Their rebellion is not shouted through megaphones, but played through violins and guitars. It is subtle, symbolic, and unstoppable. As DW reported, this spontaneous uprising was not political in form, but existential in meaning, an awakening of a generation that sees the empire crumbling in real time. Strategically, this moment carries far more weight than any battle in Ukraine. A regime can suppress protests, but it cannot silence nostalgia. The Kremlin's propaganda machine frames these acts as foreign provocations, blaming Western intelligence for psychological warfare. Yet The Guardian notes the irony: Putin's greatest enemy is not NATO, it is the collective memory of freedom among his own citizens. The parallels ripple across the world. In Iran, the youth defy moral police with music and art. In China, underground artists quietly critique the party's tightening grip. And in the West, analysts in Washington, London, and Berlin recognize the pattern: authoritarian regimes crumble first in spirit, then in structure. Under President Trump, the US leverages this psychological collapse with precision. American think tanks quoted by Defense News describe information attrition, the gradual erosion of public belief in state narratives, as the most effective non-lethal weapon against autocracies. Russia, once a master of propaganda, is now its own victim. The global contrast is striking. In the United States, dissent fuels dialogue. In Russia, it fuels detention. Yet every act of suppression deepens defiance. The young musicians of Saint Petersburg may not have intended to start a revolution, but their melody became one. As Al Jazeera observed, Swan Lake is no longer just a ballet, it's Russia's requiem. For the average Russian, this defiance is both hope and fear. Parents whisper to children to stay away from public gatherings, but secretly admire the courage of those who won't stay silent. The moral ground beneath Putin's regime is eroding faster than its economy. And so the sound that once marked the death of the Soviet Union now haunts the twilight of Putin's empire. The question rises like a ghost from the music itself. When a nation begins to mourn its leader before he has fallen, can his rule truly survive? The illusion of control, the cornerstone of Putin's two-decade reign, is now shattered. Russia's vertical of power, once touted as the backbone of stability, lies fractured beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Moscow burns, Saint Petersburg sings, and the Kremlin watches in silence. What began as a special military operation abroad has mutated into a civil conflict at home, fought between invisible borders, migrants against militias, FSB against generals, fear against reason. Reuters calls it the slow implosion of a security empire. The monopoly on violence, the sacred right of the state, has been lost. The investigative committee runs its own armed units. The FSB backs gangs that terrorize the streets. The National Guard, overwhelmed and uncertain whom to obey, hides behind bureaucracy. The Russian Federation on paper, still one nation, has splintered into zones of competing authority. DW and The Guardian report that even within Putin's inner circle, alliances are shifting hourly. Some oligarchs quietly transfer assets abroad. Others fund private security groups to defend their estates. The Kremlin's once coordinated propaganda machine now emits contradictory narratives, each ministry blaming the next. In this cacophony of chaos, one truth resounds the center no longer holds. Globally, the consequences are seismic. Beijing and Tehran, Putin's closest allies, have grown wary. China's foreign ministry avoids commenting on the internal situation, while Al Jazeera cites Iranian officials calling Moscow an unpredictable partner. In a world defined by shifting alliances, the Kremlin's reliability, its only remaining currency, has evaporated. Meanwhile, Washington moves with quiet precision. Under President Trump, the US reclaims strategic leverage once lost in years of Russian assertiveness. NATO's posture in Eastern Europe strengthens sanctions, deepen, and new defense contracts revitalize Western arms industries. Defense News reports that American military aid to Eastern Europe has surged by 30% since July, signaling a new era of deterrence. The West no longer fears Moscow, it studies its disintegration. Inside, Russia, fear has changed shape. It no longer emanates from the Kremlin, it circulates within neighborhoods. Parents fear the gangs, police fear their superiors, the powerful fear betrayal, and above all, Putin fears irrelevance. His great promise to end the chaos of the 1990s has turned into its revival. Moscow, once his fortress, has become his mirror. As Jane's Defense Weekly observes, Russia's internal disintegration will redefine global security for decades. The state that once prided itself on exporting strength now exports instability. Migrants flee the violence. Investors flee the economy. Allies flee the alliance. Even the myth of Putin as a symbol of control is bleeding out, replaced by the grim image of a man trapped in his own labyrinth of fear. And so the circle completes. The monsters he created, the migrants he exploited, and the militias he empowered have turned on each other, devouring what remains of his empire. The world watches both horrified and fascinated as Moscow burns from within and the music of Swan Lake plays once more, echoing through history's corridors. So the question that now defines this century is simple, yet terrifying. If a superpower collapses not from war, but from within, who will fill the void it leaves behind? Moscow's descent into chaos marks the collapse of Putin's once unshakable vertical of power. The migrant crisis, fueled by the regime's dependence on cheap wartime labor, collided with the rise of state-sponsored militias like the Russkaya Obstina. While the FSB hunts its own generals and the investigative committee funds rogue forces, the Kremlin has lost control of the streets it once ruled by fear. In Saint Petersburg, defiant youth revive Swan Lake, the death song of Soviet tyranny, signaling the psychological psychological fracture of the Russian state. Internationally, Putin's image as a guarantor of stability disintegrates as China and Iran lose faith, and Washington under President Trump consolidates power across NATO and Eastern Europe. Russia's implosion now threatens to reshape global order not through external conquest, but through internal decay. The empire's collapse has begun not with tanks, but with silence and song.